When you look deep into the eyes of another and don't see your own beauty reflected back at you, the unconscious is holding you back. The unconscious behaviors are making every attempt to remain unseen, to put up walls and keep people at arm's length. To be clear, the unconscious is not made up of thoughts, yet dictates your very behavior. And quite often this happens automatically, even without your own awareness. So let's have a look at some of the ways that the unconscious deflects attention and prevents you from being seen. Humor, when used as a remark to shift the spotlight and get away with bad behavior. Sarcasm as a way to dismiss saying what you actually feel. Intellectualism as an attempt to cope with being the center of attention. Perfectionism to hide the shame of your own imperfections, and isolation to withdraw from social contracts and appear needless, as if you don't need anything from anyone. The list of unconscious behaviors is exhaustive, and when people first become aware of their unconscious behaviors, an incessant need arises to control their thoughts and even reprogram the unconscious. In this video, I'm not going to talk about reprogramming the unconscious. There's many videos on this. What I'm going to talk about is what is the unconscious really, without the hype, without the glorification, and is it even possible to reprogram? When I talk about the unconscious, I'm specifically referring to the inefficient behavioral patterns that is not available to our own introception. I'm not referring to the medical emergency of being knocked out, not breathing but alive, or in a coma. And I do not use the words unconscious and subconscious interchangeably. I'll talk about the subconscious in my next video in the Build Your Brain series, where we dive deep into how the subconscious regulates the autonomic functions of the nervous system. The unconscious exists because the brain is a metabolically expensive structure and uses 20% of your metabolic energy at rest, even though it only weighs 2% of your body mass. And this is 10 times more energy than any other organ in the body. And unlike our conscious processing, which uses feedback information, our unconscious often uses feed-forward processing and relies on context to estimate the best guess of reality. And this is clear when the brain is trying to process an optical illusion where there is a contradiction of reality. For example, the hourglass image. In this image, do you see an hourglass or do you see two faces? And even when you know that this is an illusion, the brain still tries to fight between the two contradictions because processing of faces is prioritized. And this is perhaps why we often see faces when we look up into the clouds, or when we are kids we might have been afraid of shadows because we inherently fear what we do not understand. It is important to understand that the brain is doing its best to piece reality together, but does not always get it right. And in order to minimize uncertainty, the brain manufactures psychological archetypes that offer the best chance of survival. In a perfect world, the manufactured archetypes mature into a healthy ego, which includes setting healthy boundaries, asking for your needs to be met in clear and timely manner, and allowing people to help you instead of pushing them away. Because of the prolonged period of parental care, human children have the evolutionary benefit of being nuanced in their psychological development. However, this comes at a price because we're not born with an accurate psychological map, and life always has other plans. As children, we start to develop our own psychological roadmaps for survival, and since these roadmaps are unconscious, it is rarely evaluated and often develops unchecked. The accumulation of childhood behavioral patterns later matures into what we refer to as the ego. And as we've seen with the hourglass illusion, the brain being an expensive structure, it tries to predict its best guess of reality. But this perspective does not often neatly fit with reality itself. As we know, the ego is the self-enhanced or self-deflating autobiographical deduction of the subjective importance that we place on ourselves. And despite what you might think, the anatomy of the ego is relatively easy to characterize. And this can be done through brute force statistical analysis, such as the neo-5-factor inventory that gives rise to the big 5 personality types, or it can be done through more mystical approaches, such as the Enneagram. And this is perhaps why we might not have met the same person, but you would know someone like the people who I'm about to describe. For example, the caretaker who looks after other people as a way of taking attention away from their own needs, yet this gives rise to considerable amounts of confusion as the caretaker questions whether they'll still be loved if it weren't for their constant flattery. Or take the idealist who's figured out that the only logical solution to get all their needs met is to not have any at all. And thus begins this self-fulfilling prophecy of what they want the most always being slightly out of reach, because it's near impossible to receive when it directly contradicts with a deeply held self-belief. If you'd like to learn more about personality types, you can research the Big Five or other personality types, or jump onto my Training Nervous System online course where I share my views on the Enneagram personalities and the exact childhood patterns that are responsible for fabricating them. When it comes to rectifying ineffective behavioral patterns, we must consider whether we are manufacturing another ego, or are we addressing the underlying unconscious infrastructure? There's two things inherently wrong with working with the ego. Firstly, if we are inventing a desired ego in an attempt to hide our mistakes, imperfections, and shame, then we are reinforcing the false belief that we are unlovable simply as we are. Secondly, it's not healthy to keep things smooth and under control, and this is because this is another protective mechanism that is avoiding anything that conflicts with the deeply held false belief. The problem with reprogramming the unconscious or using big words like reticular activating system or law of attraction and many more is that it is subjecting the unconscious to see a certain way and essentially manufacturing a new ego. Yet we don't actually know what is wrong, what is right, what is illusion, and what is real. And so to condition the unconscious makes absolutely no sense. And this is perhaps why in many ancient scriptures the ego is simply referred to as illusion. Regardless of what self-image you might create beneath the surface, beyond the reach of our conscious perception, the unconscious holds you back. If you feel inundated by exhaustive strategies and have been trying everything under the sun, maybe this is the reason why it is not working. The solution then is what no one wants to talk about, and that is the complete and utter dissolution of the self. And this is where psychology falls short, because psychology is fundamentally rooted in characteristics, and the lack thereof renders the science meaningless beyond this point. To grab a grasp of how deeply invested the brain is in reconstructing reality, let's do an experiment. Become comfortable and take notice of where you are right now. Perhaps you're in a room. Take notice of all the objects that are around you. And now, instead of looking at the objects, observe the empty space that is between them. How does this change your perception? Does the environment around you become more vivid? What happens when your attention is freed from the traps of the visible? Do you feel as if there's a veil that has been lifted off your mind? Do you find that beauty is no longer hidden from your eyes, but all around you? How does this shift in perception change your relationship with abandonment, rejection, loneliness, and shame? If you find yourself in a moment of crisis, what version of yourself have you created that has put you in this position? Have you been trying to create the best version of yourself? Is this psychological roadmap effective? Are you getting frustrated by using an inaccurate roadmap? And is your only alternative to try harder at what does not work? monks, yogis, and other gatekeepers of ancient wisdom have devoted countless hours to find rest in this natural great peace. This is what prolonged periods of meditation leads to. Yet the stillness in life that we seek does not exist. As I mentioned before, it's not healthy to keep everything in life smooth and under control. Take a monk outside the monastery and isolate them from the spiritual nursery, get them to work like everyone else, fall in love and pay rent. Does this stillness still remain? I had the great fortune of experiencing the complete dissolution of the self accidentally when I had a near-death experience at the age of 23. And I share a full recollection of this in a dedicated video linked here. If you end up watching the video, you'll realize that I would not wish this experience on anyone, yet I've dedicated my entire life to get a glimpse of what I had experienced before. And it didn't matter what I tried, whether it was meditation, sacred rituals, or psychotropic experiences, nothing remotely came close, and I was never able to return back to what I'd experienced before until I realized that this experience had never left me in the first place. And I've spent nearly 2 decades researching academically, and I think the very nature of being a neuroscientist, or any scientist for that matter, is to look for evidence or reconsider everything that you've been led to believe. And I've checked and I've cross-checked, and time again, there's only one conclusion that I keep returning back to, and that is love. It does not matter which way you look at it. If you struggle to look people in the eye, it is not anyone else that is making you uncomfortable. It is you who has to have a hard look at yourself. And the same is true if you find yourself pushing away the person you love the most. And this is where there are unconscious patterns of abandonment, rejection, loneliness, and shame that is keeping you from being seen and preventing you from receiving what you want the most, which is ultimately love. And in the next video of the Build Your Brain series, we will look at how the subconscious traps trauma in the body and keeps you from love.